All right, everybody, now we're going to start our second part of the Chapter 22 video, and we're going to be focusing on inflation. So remember that the definition of inflation is a rise in the general level of prices. So when we say general level, it's just, everything is becoming more expensive. And the problem with inflation is that your dollar just doesn't go as far. You lose purchasing power. Now, of course, how we measure it is important. So the CPI is it's what we use most frequently, though there are lots of different price indices. So what we're doing basically is we are taking, the year two minus year one, and then dividing by year one, and that's how you're going to get it. Okay, so basically it's where we were. Where we are this year minus where we were last year. So the change from one year to the next divided by last year gives us our inflation rate. So you can see some inflation rate from some industrial nations. That's kind of interesting. Here is the rate of inflation. Now notice whenever the inflation rate is above zero, we are going up. Okay, so inflation is rising. Even here, for example, when the slope is going down, since it is positive, it's above zero, we are still experiencing inflation. Okay, what this downward trend means is that the inflation rate is slowing. So the prices are rising, but they are rising more slowly than they were at a higher point. So prices were rising at 10% in 1981 or 80 and a half, and then down here they were only rising at 2%, for example. So 10% versus 2%. Now both of those are positive, so don't lose sight of that. So there are two types of inflation, and keeping them separate is sometimes difficult, but it's important. So demand pull inflation that comes from excess spending. So basically, when there's a lot of money relative to the amount of output, the amount of stuff, then what you have is everybody's got a big fat wallet and they go out and they buy everything, and everything that they're buying is more than what's getting produced, which means that prices rise because businesses don't want to sell out. They want to capture all of that cash, right? So they're just going to raise prices in order to capture the cash that people are willing to put out. Okay. This can also happen if the central bank issues too much money. This is something that gets tossed around in the media a lot in terms of the United States, but when we're really talking about it, in other countries, we see hyperinflation because the central bank issues money, typically in order to inflate their currency to pay back debt. But that's a much more complex thing. When you hear politicians or talking heads saying that the Federal Reserve is just printing money, blah, 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 be highly suspect of that. There are certainly issues that you can agree with or disagree with, but we are not talking about what some of the undeveloped, heavily indebted nations are doing. Now the opposite, or not opposite, but the other kind of inflation is called cost push inflation. And that happens when per unit input costs rise. Okay, so if it costs more to make stuff tomorrow than it did today, then you're going to have higher per unit input costs. So if wages rise sharply or raw materials rise sharply, the most common thing that happens here is the price of gasoline rises dramatically. And since gasoline is pretty involved in everything, whether that's the creation of things or shipping things around or whatever, you're going to see cost push inflation due to energy costs frequently. And obviously, any kind of supply shock. So the examples that I gave you are examples of supply shocks. All right. So what I said was complicated was trying to figure out which type of inflation is happening. And there's not a lot you can do about cost push inflation. You just hope that whatever the supply shock is sort of runs out. But for demand pull, there are some things you can do. you can do some things to decrease the excess spending. Okay, so and we'll talk about what some of those things are later on. Now, core inflation is this thing that matters, but it's a little bit misleading from the public's standpoint. So core inflation is when we take out food and energy, what is happening to the price of stuff. Problematically, for a huge portion of Americans, a significant portion of their budget is taken up with food and energy. So if you have high inflation within food and energy, even if your core inflation is very low, right? So core inflation would be all the other stuff. So, the price of cars isn't going up fast, and the price of electronics isn't going up fast, and the price of other things like that. If that's not going up fast, but a huge portion of the amount of money you spend is wrapped up in food and energy, then your experience is that inflation is high. Okay, so the advantage of core inflation is that it is much more stable, but the disadvantage of the core inflation rate is that to the average person, it's not particularly useful. For businesses, though, it is probably a lot more useful, since businesses clearly don't spend a lot of money on food, and depending on the industry, they may spend a lot on energy or not. All right, so when we have inflation, there are winners and losers. Okay, so your nominal income is not adjusted for inflation, but your real income is. So if you get a raise of 2% this year over last year, you are making 2% more in nominal income. But if the inflation rate is 3%, then yes, you're making more nominal income, but your real income actually went down. So you've got your nominal income, which we said in that example was plus 2%. So you get a 2% raise, but you have a 3% inflation rate. Then what that means is your real income actually went down by 1%. So getting a raise isn't enough. You have to get a raise that outpaces inflation if you want to be better off next year than you were this past year. All right, so who is hurt by inflation? If you're on a fixed income, then your real income will fall relative to inflation. If you are a person who saves a lot, then your accumulated savings will go away because of the inflation. And creditors who loaned money to other people at fixed interest rates are getting paid back with inflated dollars, right? So if you loaned money out to somebody expecting to get paid 6%, and then they are paying you back but inflation happened in the meantime, right? So then you subtract the 3% inflation. Your real rate of return as a lender is only 3%. Okay, so that's something to consider as well. Who is unaffected? So if you have a flexible income, meaning you get a raise that is attached to cost of living. So COLA is a cost of living adjustment, and some jobs have COLAs. Your pay might be attached to some cost of living. COLAs are typically involved for union members. Social Security is adjusted periodically for inflation. And then anybody who is in debt and is paying their loan back with cheaper dollars. So again, this is only fixed debt. Obviously, some debt, like credit card debt, those rates can fluctuate relative to the credit market, which of course takes into account some of the inflation changes. All right, now, some inflation we anticipate. Okay, we expect inflation to come. So those lenders will expect a certain amount of a certain amount of inflation, so they charge higher interest rates so that they can get what they need. So if I am a lender and I know that, I need to make 6% for it to be worthwhile. I shouldn't have done it there. I need 6% in order to loan money that, to make it worth my while, and I anticipate a 3% inflation rate, then I'm going to have to charge a 9% interest rate. in order to get my 6% real rate of return. Okay, so you better believe that banks and other people are certainly trying to figure out what the anticipated inflation rate is. And as long as everybody is sort of correct that what actually happens is similar to what we anticipated, then this system works. And, you know, you pay a market rate of 6%. It costs you 9%, but over time, that 3% is going to erode the 9 back to a real rate of 6. So here's another way of looking at that. Your nominal interest rate equals your real plus the inflation premium. So the investors are really getting 5% of the 11, and then 6% is eaten up in inflation. All right, so deflation is what happens when the value of your purchasing power rises, meaning the value of your dollar falls. It seems like it would be a good idea. And seems like it would feel really good for everybody because your real income can rise, but the value of fixed assets falls, and it can, so deflation is actually considered a larger threat than moderate inflation. So what deflation really means, it's a relatively complicated thing, but ultimately, if you are convinced that your money is going to be worth more tomorrow than it is today, you're not going to spend any money. If you don't spend any money today, then businesses won't sell anything. If businesses don't sell anything, then they will start laying off workers. And that deflation, which even though it seems good in the short run, it actually winds up causing some really big problems because everybody just holds on to their money in anticipation of it being worth more tomorrow. That's the real problem. Then recessions come and all sorts of bad stuff. So we fear deflation in the US economy more than moderate inflation. All right, so how does inflation affect output? Well, cost push inflation is going to reduce real output, and it's going to redistribute a decreased level of real income. Demand pull is going to basically create a situation where you're making as much as you can, and price just takes it. So it just takes the extra money up. So some people view that zero inflation is the best. The problem with zero is it's really close to deflation, to negative, which is why most economists look for mild inflation. The inflation target is typically 2%. So if we experience inflation of 1%, we are still not in a deflationary situation. So things are okay. Whereas if we target 0% and then we have a -1, now we're in deflation. The difference away from the target, the delta from the target is the same. This is going to have bad implications. This is really not going to have bad implications, which is why mainstream economists typically focus on a low, mild inflation rate. And 2% is the Federal Reserve's target interest rate currently. All right, so hyperinflation is basically just really, really bad inflation. Everybody wants to know like what makes it hyper versus regular, and there's no hard and fast line. But clearly, you hear about Germany around the world wars, and clearly Zimbabwe when you could get a $10 trillion note or a $100 trillion note. Just absolutely crazy inflation rates, and economies basically collapse because the money becomes worthless. So stock prices are going to be not the best measures of the economy as a whole. So the wealth effect states that people do not like their wealth to go down. So even people who are very wealthy will stop spending in order to maintain their certain level of wealth, even though they clearly don't have to. That's the wealth effect. Then the investment effect is a little bit different. We can talk about that in a different video. And then you're going to have just weird other aspects of the market kind of behaving irrationally and stuff like that. Stock market bubbles are things that exist. We have bubbles not just in the stock market, but there can be a bubble in any market. And that's just a big rise in price due to excessive optimism or frenzied buying or whatever. Just basically buying for the sake of buying or buying because everybody else is buying, as opposed to the fact that the thing whose price is going up is actually worth more. And inflation, typically can get us there. And that is going to do it for chapter 26, part 2. Have a good one, guys.